Thanks for joining us here into the weeds. We're talking about Erez Reuveni, right? As Erez.
Erez.
I want to make sure I get the pronunciation correct. Erez Reuveni is the name of this gentleman. He's a whistleblower that has come out and filed a complaint against the Trump administration for ignoring court orders with regards to immigration. It's an important case, also an important case with regards to this show, because it directly involves one of the principles that we have talked about in our Authoritarian series, which is the Jacksonian principle. Those who recall from our Authoritarian series, if you haven't seen it, you should go back and watch it just so you understand. The Jacksonian principle is essentially the idea that, like Andrew Jackson, the president, who essentially defied the Supreme Court during his tenure with regards to the Trail of Tears, he said something akin to, "I have heard what the Chief Justice has to say, and I invite him now to execute it," right? Because obviously the judiciary doesn't have the military, the executive branch does. So in any situation where a president is ignoring judicial findings, that is problematic with regards to our findings on authoritarianism. So it's important that we get to the bottom of this. Erez Reuveni, I am going to let Phil get into the weeds on exactly what he has said and is complaining, and then we can talk a little bit more about it. Go ahead, my friend.
Okay, and then this, Jubal and I haven't talked about this, but it might be one area where we agree, and so we'll just have to see as we go through it. The first thing I want to talk about before we get into the details of this whistleblower complaint is I think it's really important to address like a false narrative, namely the idea that Mr. Reuveni is a partisan actor, a secret Democrat, a never Trumper, or anything like that. That simply doesn't hold up when you look at his record. So Mr. Reuveni is a career employee at DOJ. He joined in 2010, and he served under the first Trump administration, but he also served under the Biden administration. So under Trump, Mr. Reuveni defended some of the most controversial and high profile policies related to immigration, because that's his area of expertise. So he was one of the main lawyers arguing in favor of the travel ban. He was one of the main lawyers arguing in favor of the Remain in Mexico program, the restrictions that were put on asylum eligibility, and he even led the DOJ's lawsuit against California sanctuary laws, something that may be come up again. We'll deal with that in the future. And they weren't just technical legal defenses. He was at the center of defending President Trump's core immigration agenda in the first administration. Now you fast forward to the Biden administration. Mr. Reuveni remained in DOJ and continued to defend the administration's policies. This time, though, he was on the opposite side of the spectrum. He argued in favor of President Biden's asylum officer rule that essentially gave the U.S. CIS the ability to grant someone asylum rather than having to go to an immigration court. He was defended the humanitarian parole programs, and he actually led the effort to rescind the Remain in Mexico policy. He had argued in favor of it before. He argued against. In every case, he made legal arguments supporting the sitting administration's positions, regardless of whether it's Democratic or Republican.
So
So
he
I
argued
just
he argued in favor of Remain in Mexico during Trump 1, and then he argued against Remain in Mexico during Biden.
Right, exactly. So this is the quintessential example of what what a lot of people at DOJ do. Their job is to defend the administration. And so that's what this guy does. And there's countless others like him. And I don't know if Jubal had heard anything about him being a secret Democrat. I know some people in the White House administration and the White House had made that claim. It's just not true. And so I just wanted to clear that up before we talk about any of that. So I don't know if you had heard anything different, Jubal. So
Sure. I mean, from the same talking heads who accuse anybody who disagrees with Donald Trump of being a secret Democrat have said that he's a secret Democrat, but that doesn't mean that they're accurate or that they're credible, right? I'm with you in the sense that what. Oh, are we pausing? Okay.
So I think you should start over with.
And we're back. Phil got a call from his girlfriend, interrupted the podcast. Now we're going forward. So this guy, yeah, the sources that call him a secret Democrat are the same people who accuse anybody of being a secret Democrat. It doesn't mean anything to me. It probably doesn't mean anything to most people. It's just filling up news minutes. But I haven't seen anything to convince me that he's anything other than a government employee who, as you say, has worked for both sides and has tried to do his job the best he can. Who came out with what appears to be, at least from his point of view, a legitimate complaint. So go ahead.
Okay, and I'm glad that we talked about it, and I appreciate Jubal's comment on it. There are a whole bunch of people who work in the government who this is exactly what they do. They're there as public servants, and what they do is they serve whichever administration is in office. And I think Mr. Reuveni is like a perfect example of somebody, when I first read that he'd argued in favor of the Remain in Mexico and then against Remain in Mexico, it's like, yeah, this is exactly how these people are. They have a job to do. They're a lawyer. And lawyers frequently defend their clients, and it has nothing to do with whether they believe their client. This is their job, and so that's the story. So in the actual whistleblower complaint, um, they basically opened by affirming what Jubal and I had just talked about, was that Mr. Reuveni has been a loyal public servant. And then there are basically three complaints that are included. So let's start with section 2. So it's section 2, 3, and 4. Jubal, did you have a chance to look this over?
So I've read most of the complaint. I haven't read probably the last 25%.
Okay, so okay, and then actually that's probably the least explosive part. So in section 2 of the complaint, this part describes what Reuveni saw happening inside of the Department of Justice after he was promoted. So he was the acting deputy director of the Office of Immigration Litigation. He was appointed in March 2025. Almost immediately, he says, he discovered the top DOJ and DHS Department of Homeland Security
Homeland Security.
officials were preparing to ignore multiple federal court orders in order to deport migrants after President Trump invoked the Alien Enemies Act. So in one case, a judge, Judge Boasberg, who we've since heard a lot about, had clearly ordered the government not to deport a group of Venezuelan men. Now, in this particular case, there wasn't in this order, there wasn't a national injunction. The order was not to deport 5 men who were named in the case, and even ordered Judge Boasberg ordered if they were in the air, they had to be returned. But despite that, the flights still took off. And DOJ officials claimed that because the judge's orders hadn't been written down yet, they didn't have to be followed, even though they'd already been told verbally what the court required. Now, Reuveni says he tried repeatedly to get confirmation from DHS that they were following the order, and he was met with silence. He sent a number of emails, and people never responded. Even worse, some of the deported migrants ended up at CCOT. That's been widely condemned as for human rights abuses, for torture, and other things. But that's where they wound up. So, from Reuveni's point of view and his complaint, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate decision on the part of DOJ and White House leadership to evade the court's authority. And when Jubal and I were talking privately, he'd asked me, does he have documentation to back this? He has all kinds of emails that he sent that weren't responded to, and some that were. And as you'll see in the other part of the complaint, he was eventually told, stop sending emails. So that was the first one. The second complaint, what Reuveni says is he was involved in three different cases where DOJ leadership either gave him misleading information to the courts, withheld key facts, and ordered him directly to make false statements, which he refused to do. Now, again, by the way, one of the things that Reuveni did when he issued his complaint is he says, and I want to make sure I have the wording correctly. So um, on the bottom of his complaint, it says, Mr. Reuveni affirms under penalty of perjury that the information contained in this complaint is true and correct to the best of his knowledge, information, and beliefs. So while it wasn't a sworn affidavit, it was submitted with a formal affirmation under penalty of perjury. So I want to be clear about that. That one of the things that Jubal and I talked about in a completely different context is when you can assign truth value to something, what somebody says. And what we agreed was that when somebody says something under oath, it doesn't mean they're telling the truth, but because it's costly to lie under oath, you can get thrown in jail, you can be disbarred. That we tend to, all else being equal, we tend to view that as more authoritative. People say shit on the media in the media all the time, and they're never held accountable. At least
There's
not
no penalty for lying on the Sunday shows, right?
right.
There's no
Exactly.
penalty for
There
going
is
out
a
on the
penalty,
airways. There is a penalty for
absolutely,
lying under oath.
in court.
So
So
that incentive, the incentive is to tell the truth. So you just recognize that there's a greater incentive. If somebody's under oath, they're more likely telling the truth as they see it than if they're on a Sunday show.
right, and then so that's what we agreed with, and we stipulated it doesn't mean they're telling the truth. We
Right.
just think that all else being equal, that's going to have more weight than what's said on the Sunday shows.
Right.
So in the three cases, in one of the cases, a federal judge had issued a nationwide injunction saying that the U.S. couldn't deport migrants to third countries without first checking if they'd be at a risk of torture. Um, Reuveni made sure the legal briefs acknowledged the order but he later found out that DHS never told its field officers and that migrants were being staged to be deported anyways. When he pressed DHS for answers, he said that the DOJ leadership told him to stop asking questions and to stop putting anything in writing, which is problematic because these kind of communications for historical record and for legal reasons are always supposed to be put in writing so they can be looked back on. For Reuveni, he said the final straw came when he was assigned the case of Kilmer Abrego Garcia, who we talked about in another one of our videos, who had a court order protecting him not from deportation, but specifically from being deported to El Salvador. Um, and so he filed a statement saying that it was a mistake, that the administration wasn't aware that there was a deportation restriction, that he couldn't be sent to El Salvador. And so he was ordered by his superiors to file a brief reversing the statement and pretend that it was intentional. So he refused to do that. The next day he was put on administrative leave. And so that's the substance of it. And the part that Jubal didn't get to really is not that significant. So Reuveni essentially, not that it's not significant, but it's not substantive.
Right.
Reuveni says that everything that followed, his suspension, his firing, the public smears against him, were not because he failed to do the job, but he did his job. He told the truth to a federal judge. He refused to lie. He followed his ethical obligations as a lawyer. And for that, he was labeled a saboteur by the White House officials and accused of being a secret Democrat. For him, the message from leadership was clear: either you fall in line or you're out. And so that's the substance of his complaint, was that he was essentially asked to do things that, in his estimation, were a violation of his ethical principles and a violation of his obligation to the courts.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you.
So yeah, I know. I think that's exactly right, and I think that he behaved the way that you would want any attorney who works for the government to behave. Right?
Right.
He felt like he was being told to do things that were wrong. Now, there's another key player in this event, in this drama that we've encountered before, and that's Emil Bovy. Right?
Correct.
So, what is Bovy's relationship to
He's a,
Reuveni?
he's his superior, but I think it's not like he's immediate superior. He's like levels up
Mm-hmm.
his superior.
So, the last time we encountered Bovy was when when there were people that were leaving the Justice Department again because they thought that Bovee was giving them bad orders, right?
Right.
So this seems to be a commonplace thing with this guy now, right? This is the second time that we've seen somebody walk out because of the order that they've gotten from this gentleman.
Right,
Is
actually quite a number of people. Some of them have been more higher profile. So
mhm,
a lot of people from the DOJ Public Integrity Unit um, left. I think Daniel Sassoon was one of the ones who
right.
left. Right, so there have been a number of people who've done this. So um, this is where the question about the Madisonian principle comes in, because if the
Jacksonian.
administration, Jacksonian,
Jacksonian,
uh,
sorry.
right, no, no, no,
Madisonian is ignoring the legislature. Jacksonian is ignoring
right.
the courts.
So in this case, this is the first sort of official complaint from somebody on the inside who filed a whistleblower complaint. Now it'll be up to Michael Horowitz, who's the Inspector General of the Department of Justice, to look into the complaint. Now,
Sure.
Michael Horowitz was one of the people who was actually kept over as Inspector General. For those who don't know, each department has an inspectors general, and their job is to like root out corruption within their respective departments. So the question will be, what if anything, um, uh, Inspector General Horowitz will do about it.
So
So,
my
but it's going to be
question, I have a question for you.
shoot.
Part of this seems to relate to the injunction that Boasberg filed, right? And we've seen the recent ruling from the Supreme Court with regards to injunctions. Does that deflate this case to some extent, in your estimation?
I don't think so, because in the case of Boasberg, the original order was not a nationwide injunction. The original order was not to deport the five people who were directly named in the
Hmm.
five Venezuelans. So the original order was to stop their deportation. Afterwards, that's when he certified everybody who was on the plane or subject to removal as a class, right? And so I don't know whether, so he didn't do a nationwide injunction. So I don't think it applies here, because they were like class certified, which is sort of a complicated legal process.
Hmm.
So I don't think it would apply here. I do think that some of the later injunctions certainly are going to have to be revisited
Sure.
by the lower courts. But here's the thing about the way temporary restraining orders are supposed to be dealt with. And actually, Chief Justice Roberts was the one who said this. If a lower court issues an unconstitutional temporary restraining order, the the proper response is not to ignore it, but to appeal it. And so simply ignoring it because anybody ignoring it simply because they believe it's unconstitutional is not the appropriate response. Now, after the latest Supreme Court ruling, judges simply won't issue them, or they'll limit it to either the plaintiffs in the case, or if they're going to do an injunction, it would be within the specific district or maybe state that they're residing in.
So, in my estimation, I think that the Supreme Court finding did take the wind out of the sails of this a little bit, in the sense that it's going to be very easy for everybody involved to just kind of sweep this under the rug and say, well, it doesn't matter now, right? What the Boasberg's injunction doesn't matter because now it's unconstitutional, blah, blah, blah. There's going to be a lot of, revision that happens.
Right.
I would like to know if his accusations are true, in the sense that he was told to do things that were illegal. And if that is the case, then I think that it's worth examining those communications to determine if he actually was being told to do something that was illegal. I kind of trust this guy's gut more than I trust the spin that's going to come from higher ups. Does that make
Right.
sense? Right.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
So.
because just like you, sorry to interrupt, but just like you and I had talked about in another life, about the idea that when you testify under oath, it's more
Mhm,
costly. For Mr. Reuveni, this was really costly. I
mhm,
mean, I think he had to know that when he went ahead and said, "I'm not going to follow this order," it probably didn't surprise him that he was fired. So this came at a personal cost to him.
Sure.
And so when you see
No,
people take it, go
but
ahead.
just because he felt that he felt that he was being told to do something that was inappropriate or unconstitutional doesn't necessarily mean that he was being told that. That needs to be corroborated with evidence.
Right,
And that's why I would want this case to continue. Look, if there are bad actors that are encouraging government lawyers to lie, then yeah, yeah, I feel like that's kind of an important thing to get that out. However, we're all fallible, and so I'm not in a situation where I'm going to say that I think he's absolutely right because I haven't seen his corroborating material.
right.
So I do hope that there is some progress on this case. My gut tells me that there's probably this is going to be a flash in the pan. We're not going
And,
to hear
and,
any more
and I
about it.
don't think it will. Let me explain why. But I'm not a lawyer, but let me explain why. Because I think that there were two contempt proceedings that were started, one in Judge Boasberg's court and one in Judge Zena's court. And the contempt proceedings had specifically to do with sort of the claims that Mr. Reuveni is making, regardless of whether or not um, judges are allowed to issue nationwide injunctions, has no bearing on a lawyer's obligation as an officer of the court.
Right.
And so I think that the contempt cases will continue on. And according to the whistleblower complaint, Mr. Reuveni, like any good lawyer, has all kinds of documentation. So
Good.
dates. So the summary, just so you guys know, the summary that I provided in the whistleblower complaint, it was like a day by day breakdown of exactly what happened, how many emails were sent, who was emailed, what the responses were, all that kind of stuff. So
So what
that
is
that
your what is your prediction about how this is going to turn out, or where it's going to go next?
in a, I'm it's hard to know. I mean,
Mm.
I wonder if for me, if Michael Horowitz, realistically speaking, my prediction is that Michael Horowitz will slow walk the investigation into this thing, um, so that hopefully it gets less attention. I don't know if the
Mhm.
judges are going to let it go, but the courts move
Oh,
slowly.
hang on just one second. And we're back. I was interrupted by my girlfriend, so now we're even.
You were
Okay,
interrupted by your wife. Wait a
that's
minute.
right. Slow. Well, she's both. Slow walk.
Right. So my guess would be that he would slow walk it. As far as the case with Judge Zenas and Judge Boasberg, um, contempt proceedings take a long time. So
Right.
I don't think anything is going to happen anytime soon as a
Right.
result of
You
this.
know, it's funny. So at the end of all of this, like the real tragedy, I think, is that Ruveni's not working for the government anymore.
Right.
Really,
I
that's the
agree.
worst. That's the worst thing that's come from this is that a good attorney is no longer working for the government.
Right. And a
And
loyal servant. I mean, there have been quite a few people who have left this administration for
mhm,
different versions of the same reason. And I think this is should be a cause for concern, but it never gets it's not nearly as sexy as deporting people, sending them off
sure,
to prison.
sure.
The judicial system moves slowly. And so I imagine news coverage of this will fall off. That's why we're here, folks,
Yeah,
to get
it's
into the weeds.
to get into the weeds. So I guess we're gonna have to, keep our eyes peeled. Maybe at some point in the future we'll come back, revisit this, and talk a little bit about what's developed, and we'll see if any of our predictions have come true.
That
Um,
episode will be called Reuveni Revisited.
that's right.
Here we go.
All right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. That
Take
was
care,
the
everybody.
Reuveni episode. Take care.